I recently got a phone call from a reporter from Europe, and this reporter asked me what my thoughts were on the state of science. What is the state of science right now? What is the state of science going forward? Will we survive COVID 19 in terms of a profession? And I was quite pessimistic. I told him that the state of the science was weak, science was in shambles, and we needed a lot of work if we were going to recover for the next crisis. So, why do I say that? I thought it might be useful, instructive even, for me to talk for a few minutes about what makes me come to this point of view. I guess I would say my view about this pandemic from March until the present day, actually, we can go back a little bit earlier, we can go to January to the present day, gives me a lot of reasons why I'm deeply concerned about the state of our enterprise. So let's start in January. January, February, we were talking a little bit about SARS-CoV-2. I remember there was a New York Times story, it might have been even been in December, where they built a hospital from the ground up in Wuhan, and you watched the ingenuity of the Chinese government, how quickly they could build a hospital. But that was also a warning that things were not doing so well in that city. But in the weeks that followed, a number of pundits went on TV, and they said repeatedly, over and over, that we had nothing to worry about. They said that flu kills more people than COVID-19. In fact, flu had already killed more people than COVID-19, so we should be more worried about the flu than COVID-19. These are the same pundits we still hear from today. Why did they get it wrong? Of course, they got it wrong because of what Nicholas Taleb calls fat-tailed probability, that even though the risk of the event at that moment was less, there was a much higher probability of an extreme event with SARS-CoV-2 than seasonal influenza, at least in that season. And in fact, that's what happened. Then we go forward, we go into March, and what we see is there was a void in the media empire. There was a void of people commenting intelligently about the policy, and we were moving into sort of hitherto unembarked states. I mean, we had never shut down society globally, shut down travel as broadly as we did in those weeks in March. And what you saw in the media and you saw on social media was the rise of the science communicator. The science communicator and scientist are kind of two different things. Science communicator is somebody who at peacetime can often be quite good. There are a lot of issues that there is a strong and long-standing scientific consensus, and a science communicator can go and advocate for those issues. For instance, people who are less fortunate may have less access to good antihypertensive control. A science communicator can go push on those issues, the importance of blood pressure control. They can push on the importance of routine childhood vaccination and dispel some of the long-standing myths. Science communicator can do a good job of talking about why many of those fly-by-night products don't actually improve your health, like wearing magnets on your wrist or taking some potion or something that comes from a flower or grass, how those things don't have any convincing data that they work. And we saw science communicators increasingly move into SARS-CoV-2, of course, because that's where the interest was. But they were ill-suited in a few ways. One, they had not really spent a lot of time grappling with unprecedented policy decisions and thinking through the facts that sometimes you just don't know what's the right answer, and you do want to facilitate rather than curtail a debate. I think early on in the pandemic, one of the egregious errors made by some of these people was the hydroxychloroquine debacle. It was a debacle in a few directions. Of course, hydroxychloroquine had some laboratory evidence of promise. It had some early, I think, unconvincing data from China, but some early uncontrolled data from China that it was administered, and some people were thought to have done better than what you would have expected. Now, I tweeted, I think, in April of last year, my pretest probability that the drug worked, and it was sort of a Bayesian distribution, but it had a big spike on it, don't work at all. And I've talked in prior videos on this channel that my pretest probability any drug works for some novel purpose, whether it's a new drug or a repurposed drug, it's generally low. I have low pretest probability. That's an empirical claim. I come to that after many empirical studies looking at pretest probability. But what we saw was a politician who was incredibly divisive and people felt very strongly about in all directions. He came out in support of hydroxychloroquine. And in fact, there's a nice paper, I think, by Kesselheim and colleagues in JAM-IM looking at prescribing of hydroxychloroquine after Trump said, you ought to think about using it. But what we saw in response to that was an interesting counter-movement. Hydroxychloroquine wasn't something that was wrongly endorsed based on early and inconclusive data. It was increasingly something that was portrayed as poisonous, harmful, the side effects were severe, the AEs were unpredictable, and if anything, people opposed, I think, to Donald Trump exaggerated the downsides of the medication. And a number of ongoing randomized controlled trials were trying to be conducted, and they suddenly found a loss of interest for two reasons. Some people were devotees. They believed that it was going to work no matter what. And other people were critics, and they thought they wouldn't even want a chance of even taking hydroxychloroquine. Boy, it's a poison after all. And so the irony there is that we were losing science already. It was slipping through our fingers. And it was slipping through our fingers, I think, because it was being politicized. That we were anchoring it, hydroxychloroquine, to the fate of this person that many people dislike, particularly people in the academy. And the response wasn't sort of equipoise. It was, we got to go the other direction and be overly critical of it. And I think we saw that at a number of other junctions. I imagine sometimes in sort of in a counterfactual world, what might have happened had Trump been very forceful about lockdowns and shelter in place rather than been reluctant to embrace those tactics. Had he been forceful, I think you would have seen in the academy a much larger split. You would have seen a lot of people in the academy become critical of lockdowns and shelter in place for a prolonged period of time. But part of the reason it reversed was that he seemed so, shall we say, not that interested in those policies or, if anything, critical of those policies. Fast forward a little bit into the summer of 2020. What happened? We had the press release results of the recovery trial. And this is another great example of, I think, how science was increasingly ripped to bits. The recovery trial was run by the Oxford investigators. It was different than a lot of other studies. They had pre-registered their statistical analysis plan. It was available on the internet. The protocol was available on the internet. It was a mega randomized controlled trial. And when those authors put out their press release, they did something incredible. They found dexamethasone was life-saving for people who were on the vent, who required oxygen, but it was actually perhaps even detrimental in people hospitalized not requiring oxygen. They had pre-registered that subgroup, and they had a statistically significant interaction coefficient, which is not what you see all the time with subgroups. In fact, you seldom see well done, pre-specified, powered subgroup analyses, but you saw it with recovery. And you could check the statistical analysis plan, you could check the protocol. And what were we doing in those days prior to it? We were playing cowboy medicine. Not a week went by where I didn't read some report of some doctor in some hospital throwing the kitchen sink at some patient with SARS-CoV-2. Or many hospitals that I'm aware of, many hospitals that I have colleagues who work in, were telling me about protocols, giving this drug or that drug off-label, off-protocol. But alas, we had a light in the darkness. We had randomized control trial data showing steroids save lives. And I went on Twitter and I said something like, at this point, not only ought you do it, it would be unethical not to do it and wait for this published paper, which isn't going to change the results. But we got pushback there. And the pushback there was, it's not wrong to wait to the results. Of course, waiting would merely result in many casualties while you wait. It was very unlikely that these Oxford trial investigators, with their pre-registered statistical plan and protocol, were going to get things wrong. And meanwhile, the standard of care was set based on no evidence at all, so I felt like that was sort of an absurd point of view. But again, that was science at a time of crisis. And the failure there was that many people felt compelled to comment about the recovery trial. They felt compelled to be science communicators, but they may not have had the expertise in critically evaluating randomized controlled trials in rapid fashion. I'm not sure how many times they've read protocols or statistical analysis plans, and how many times they had to think about what does it mean to do medicine by press release. In fact, that was one of the things they said. This is medicine by press release. But the problem with that is that medicine by press release, it means something. It means a constellation where a for-profit invested company issues a press release to satisfy the Securities and Exchange Commission requirements and to avoid insider trading. And that press release is often threadbare and not reflective of the actual trial results. It's not the same thing as independent academic investigators in the throes of a pandemic pre-registering a mega randomized controlled trial, giving you the statistical plan, and telling you a very elegant and parsimonious result with the pre-specified interaction coefficient. That was fundamentally different. And yet they couldn't tease those two apart because it was a little learning is a dangerous thing sort of phenomenon. The next thing that happened, vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis. This put science communication to the test. Why do I say that? VIT was the fearsome complication that emerged from adenoviral vector vaccines, and it is not a good thing. It was a cerebral sinus thrombosis, a mesenteric thrombotic cascade. This was runaway platelet activation driven by platelet factor 4, a pathophysiology very similar to HIT. And when I first heard about it, and surveillance systems first picked it up, I thought, this is something you got to take seriously. Why? It wasn't just a regular AE being reported through a surveillance system. It wasn't just an AE that occurs with some baseline frequency that occurs at times. This was a hitherto unknown entity that literally has never existed aside from a few isolated idiosyncratic cases of HIT without heparin exposure. But for the most part, it had never been existing in history, in humanity. So every case of VIT was excess VIT. There's not some baseline rate of VIT and then you're having extra VIT. This was an entirely novel entity. But you saw in the world of science communication, particularly on social media, the immediate reaction was to discount it, was to say, well, let's put it in perspective. Let's compare it to women who take oral contraceptives. But of course, a woman taking oral contraceptive and getting a DVT in a calf vein is fundamentally different than someone getting a vaccine, a 20-year-old woman getting a vaccine and having a cerebral sinus thrombosis that may even lead to her death. And so I think our initial response to that was poor. It didn't reflect science. It reflected this sort of increasing culture war where to be a good person meant you have to be unfailingly pro-vaccine. To be a good scientist meant you could never consider anything about a vaccine that was unpleasant. And that sort of mantra superseded a rational consideration of the evidence. And I think a lot of the people playing in the science communication box were not well trained to evaluate rare adverse events emerging from these systems, passive collection systems. For it to emerge so quickly with that frequency, it had to be an unusual constellation. Had it been something usual, it wouldn't have reared its head with that frequency. It would have taken a lot longer to be detected. So I think that was a great failure of science. Myocarditis. I was first turned on myocarditis when somebody emailed me an article in April that came from the Times of Israel, or I think Jerusalem Post, talking about how Israel, which led the way in terms of vaccination, had identified a safety signal in boys, I think between the ages of 16 and 22 at the time, or something in that range, of excess myocarditis. And it appeared that the signal was large and it was very likely to be vaccine related due to the timing of the event. But it was very difficult to speak publicly about that for a few weeks. It wasn't until early May, I think, that the EMA announced an ongoing investigation. And that was around the time that Steph Baral and Wes Pegden and myself wrote an article in BMJ Opinion where we made the case that although EUA, emergency use authorization, was an extremely legitimate path to get a vaccine to people very quickly for adults, we felt like we ought to reconsider the use of EUA in younger age groups, particularly children, and perhaps even young adolescents. And our argument was in part influenced by the fact that there were still unknown safety signals that loomed just outside of our reach. But in the weeks that followed, of course, we learned a lot more. We learned that myocarditis due to mRNA vaccination is real. It does occur in boys, and we're still debating the frequency. But what I think was one of the failures of science was, again, having that dialogue was curtailed, was made very difficult by, I think, this reflexive idea that thinking at all about vaccines in terms of risks and benefits and having any nuance about the right vaccine for the right person at the right age, that was deemed untenable. That was deemed taboo by a group of people who I think are science communicators, who see themselves as that, but I think lack the wherewithal to really have done good science and to think about science in a very deep way. Science, of course, is not just a set of things that you believe. It's the process by which you come to believe things. So moving forward into debate, that's the next thing I had written down here. This was, I think, the greatest failure of science throughout the entire pandemic, was that we made decisions we've never made before. I mean, literally, a society has never made these decisions. The decisions were of magnitude so large, you will never have these decisions again. We're never going to close schools for a year and make a decision like that affects millions of children in so many ways, potentially beneficial. Maybe we slowed SARS-CoV-2 spread, although I have my doubts. And in many known deleterious ways, basically, possibly crippling their upward mobility, destroying their future in many ways. We don't even know all the harms. They're going to keep trickling out. And these issues became so unable to be debated fairly. They were so heated, so polarized. And if you want to ask yourself, prove to yourself that we were unable to debate these issues, here's what I'll ask you to do. Go look and see how many times CNN or 60 Minutes or PBS or Harvard or Stanford or Yale or Hopkins had a town hall where they really got people who felt very differently about these issues and had a good faith disagreement about these issues. And the answer is very few. I sought those out and I couldn't find them. These institutions that are meant to preserve a forum for robust academic dialogue, particularly in settings of uncertainty, they abdicated that responsibility because they, I fear, have become fearful of social media. They're fearful of the mob. They're fearful of what they perceive to be the majority view, and they dare not even have a debate lest they be accused of both sidesing, a word used to mean giving false equivalence to two ideas, one of which is really bad. The problem is when you're making unprecedented decisions, you don't always know what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes you might be wrong. And the fact we were unable to tolerate debate, I think, speaks deeply. The next thing I'd say is people, I've never seen it like this in the science community. When you disagree with someone, they are so incapable of focusing on the issue. They are fundamentally incapable of focusing on the issue. They only and always focus on the person making the argument. Or they disproportionately do that. Maybe rarely they focus on the issue. When you focus on issues, what you do is you don't spend your time dealing with an individual or talking about who they are or even focusing on their arguments. You push your own ideas agenda in your own op-eds, in your own videos, in your own podcasts, in your own scientific work. You push your ideas. And yet we increasingly saw people on Twitter, they became obsessed with John Ioannidis. They became obsessed with him, I think, in part because his stat article was, I think, fundamentally critical of the response. And I think his central intuition was that it's very likely that in responding to this, we might do more damage, or we might do some things that don't really solve the problem and are very damaging. But they became obsessed with that because they view it as an impediment to do these sorts of drastic things that they themselves believed in, I think. And it quickly became about him, and so much about him, and obsessing about him, from the color of his jacket to, his past papers, to whether or not he's a good person, to what his political affiliations are. I suspect, if anything, he's extremely left-leaning from the totality of his work, but that was quickly lost because he appeared on a few shows that are extremely going in the other direction, and so they labeled him as a partisan. And then just elaborate threads where they just went through in a condescending way his paper without acknowledging that all papers often have great insights and a few things that might have been phrased differently, a few things that are weaknesses, but that there is something that you can glean from that. And maybe with some more time, I think people might change on that. And so it became, endless personal attacks, and people made their whole reputation on bashing this guy who had a big reputation. And he was just one of many people, I think, who found themselves on the wrong side of what the social media communicator group felt was the right policy choices. But that's not good for science, I think, because even if you disagree with some of the things he said, I think on other things, he did offer great insights. And I've interviewed him twice for maybe about 4 hours, and perhaps someday again on my podcast. Myocarditis Part 2. Part 2, to me, is captured by the response to Mandrola, Tracy Beth Haug, Ali Kruger, Joss Stevenston. They used VAERS to try to estimate the rate of myocarditis in 12 to 15-year-old boys. And one of the things people kept saying to them is, you cannot use this surveillance system in this way. It's known to be wrong. And my problem with that argument was that, the rule, you have to understand why people say that. Why do they say that? And they say that because after somebody has anything happen to them, lots of other things can happen to them. And you need to separate the rate with which all those other things happen to them from the baseline rate with which you might expect to try to infer what the causal influence of that prior event was. In this case, the prior event was vaccination. But in this case, I think it's really different. That criticism was not apt for many ways. One, that troponin elevations in this age group, they don't just keep spontaneously happening. They happen for a reason. And the other reason it was not apt is that they did the thing that you're supposed to do, which is that a cardiologist vetted these reports in great detail. And the final thing about science is their estimate broadly compatible with other estimates? And the answer was yes. It was broadly compatible. It remains broadly compatible with Israel, Norway, Ontario province, so many places. So for you to allege that they're guilty of misinformation or polluting the scientific space, you have to do two things. One, explain the systematic failures of their paper, why it would be biased one way or the other, which I think you've not done. You've just said that they shouldn't use the data this way without getting into the details as to why and under what circumstances one oughtn't use the data that way. And two, to show that the resulting point estimate is actually incompatible with what other estimates are, and you haven't done that either. And the real reality is, so much of the motivation is just that you have a fundamentally different policy conclusion about how many shots you think this age group should get. That's fine, but be transparent about your real motives. And don't turn it into a referendum on these people. I read people argue about whether or not they had the credentials to do this or not. You can say all these things. You may score points among a faction of people who don't understand the issues, but there are a few people left, and I know they still text me, they still email me, who do understand the technical issues, and they will find that to be a specious form of argument. The last thing I would say, I've been troubled, like many people, about science and how politicized it is. Anyone who thinks that one political party has the right view of all the scientific facts, that just can't be right on. I mean, sure, some parties can get more things right than others. I don't discount that. And in fact, I have my own feelings about that. But it's impossible for any political organization to always be right about everything. And science is a method to try to get closer to the truth, to admit uncertainty. So that's the point I want to make before the last point, admitting uncertainty. One of the ways in which science failed was overstating certainty. You can't overstate certainty and expect people to take you seriously. You can't have the CDC and the AAP say you ought to mask every kid 2 to 6, and the WHO say you ought not do that. And then to try to convince people that this disagreement from two really legitimate groups of people is because they're totally wrong and we're totally right and the evidence is incontrovertible. It cannot be that way. It cannot be that way when there's global disagreements. When different countries do things differently, the science cannot be as slam dunk as you make it out to be. If it was as slam dunk as you make it out to be, there would not be those disagreements. So you are embellishing. And when you embellish, why will anyone take you seriously? You lose all your credibility in my eyes and in the eyes of many people. People can sniff that out. Last thing I'd say, I've never seen this before in science. I mean, I have been in many fierce arguments, and I don't know if people have followed me, but I've been there with the mammography and the PSA, and nobody liked my op-ed about when USPSTF went from grade D to C, and I made a joke that they were popping the champagne bottles in a stat op-ed. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying we shouldn't have the Nobel Prize. It's a serendipitous finding. It's a misleading prize. I've been in debates on genomics. Should every person get their whole genome sequenced daily? And I've been debates on cancer drugs and this, that, and the other, and on Entresto. I've been in so many debates in my career. And one of the things I noticed in these debates was that people do get angry with you. People do feel like, in the beginning of my career it was always, oh, he's too young, hasn't published enough papers, he hasn't done this, he hasn't done that. Now, of course, there's some new, then they can't check that box up, so there's a new box, which is, he's not this, he's not that, he's not that. I mean, there are always such things, and I'm used to such things. And it doesn't surprise me that others are getting that. That's a natural human thing. But what does surprise me is the appetite for people who are supposedly smart scientists to say it isn't enough to try to rebut or counter or even drown out the views of your opponents or the people who disagree with you. You need to expunge the world of those views. You need to remove those posts and not let them be able to even tweet and not let them post their preprint and retract their preprint, whatever that means. It's a preprint. It's a work in progress. Retract their speech and silence their speech and delete their channel and vanish their Facebook page. Those kind of sentiments just weren't that common in the academy. But now they're overwhelming. The chorus for that is so overwhelming. And I think that's part of the reason why these universities are scared to have debates. They don't want the debate, lest somebody want to vanish the debate from the internet. And I guess I've been troubled. I've been troubled at a few times. I'm troubled by Tom Jefferson and Carl Hennigan. Even though I've not seen eye to eye with them on every issue this pandemic, I was troubled when their Spectator article wasn't allowed to be shared on social media. Even though it wasn't exactly how I would have written it, I'm troubled with Marty Macri's article in the Wall Street Journal, which was censored on Facebook. I'm troubled by that because this is a real newspaper. This is a real professor. And you can say all the things, and I fought with Marty before. I think people forget. I wrote a whole op-ed critical of his third leading cause of death paper. You can find it. It's in Stats. So I'm happy to rebut him. But I never said his BMJ paper should be deleted from the internet. John had some videos removed from this channel. Angry Cardiologist, who's an industry insider, a pediatric cardiologist, he tweeted about the incidence of myocarditis from vaccine versus from the virus, and that was labeled misleading by Twitter, and he continues to love to show that because as time has gone on, he's been deeply vindicated. We've never had a culture of science where we were not just angry with people we disagreed with. We've always had that from Bernie Fisher to the present day, but that we wanted to remove what they said from the world, from the public record. We wanted to expunge it entirely. That is a novel cultural phenomenon, and that's deeply poisonous. So going forward, I think science is nearly doomed. I mean, I hate to say it, but you're really doomed, people. You're doomed because your institutions of higher learning don't have the courage to host debates. You're doomed because people are more likely to want to vanish your content than to allow it to persist and let history decide. And you're doomed because scientific positions and political partisan positions are so intertwined. And we have a group of people who are just shameless partisans, and they believe that what science says is what they themselves say, although that's not the case. And the ability to tolerate uncertainty has diminished. The ability to say you need to do randomized trials has gone down. People say all sorts, the same old excuses. They've used these excuses for 20 years, why you can't do a randomized controlled trial. That's not new, but it's become more vociferous, more passionate. The denial of the weakness of the evidence is louder than I've ever seen it. And so I told this reporter from Europe all these things. If we are to fix this, the fix has got to be something deep and fundamental. And if I were to call upon the people who you need to get to fix this, you need to get the deans of the universities. You need to get the presidents. You need to get the people who have the last vestige of academic authority to really lay down the law and say, it doesn't matter if our people say some things that you disagree with. That will always be the case with unprecedented policy choices. But we have to foster rather than stifle the debate. We can't take sides in these matters, and we have to really allow for a broad range of ideas to be put forward. And if we don't do that, I fear bad things are coming. So, on that positive note, this is what I told this reporter today. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, leave a message, comment. It's longer than most, but I hope you find it reflective. And this is my view after having been in this business for, publishing for maybe 12 years now and having done a few things and having participated in scientific dialogue for a long time. I've not quite seen it like this. So, until next time.